why I quit Elden Ring a year later. Somebody linked this to me and they wanted me to watch it. Here we go.
I love Elden Ring. I loved it when I first played it, and I still love it a year later. It is probably the single-handedly best game that I've ever played. One thing I found interesting, though, was despite being hyped beyond belief for this game, counting down the days until release, and really enjoying the game, I kind of stopped thinking about it for a while, and as a result, I didn't really touch the game for a very long time after a few months of it being out. And now, a year later, I think that I finally figured out why
That's what I did too. Is like after I played it the first time, I stopped playing it until like way later.
Was. The first
like I just came back
is
recently.
The biggest blessing the first time you play, and in my eyes, the biggest curse the following times. It is the open world, of course, one of the biggest changes of Elden Ring. I think to have a open world, you have to give and take away from other areas, and the quality of the experience can suffer as a result. And I actually saw this one coming. After the network test, I made a video about some worries that I had about the game. And one of my main worries was the game would be spread too thin due to the ambitious task of creating a much bigger world than before. And judging by some of the comments on the video,
I don't think that's really a bad thing. Like having the replayability for the game, it would be cool if From Software made a version of it that was effectively a boss rush, but like maybe a half and half, like a half boss rush, half like an abbreviated version of it for people to like kind of speedrun. That would be really cool, and I don't think it would be that hard to do because it would just be basically going into like the mega dungeons, like for example, like Stormvale Castle, Caelid, and then maybe also like Halig Tree and Landel, right? And like maybe another one or two. But like the game definitely, Elden Ring is an extremely long, very expansive, big game. So it's like whenever you're doing a playthrough of Dark Souls 3 or Dark Souls 1, you're talking about a 15-hour investment. Whenever you want to do an equivalent playthrough of Elden Ring, you're talking about a 150-hour investment. It's a lot more time you have to put into the game. That's just how it is.
That were made after the release of the game, it seems like I am not alone in this. The dilemma that I had was, is getting this bigger world worth it if it means that the overall world quality would be diminished? I think that the open world suffers in a lot of aspects, but the biggest ones are the dungeons, the mini-bosses, and the loot.
Dungeons, mini-bosses, and loot. I think the dungeons are pretty good. I think the mini-bosses, it's totally fair to say that they are repetitive because they are. And I think also the loot, because you're trying to find so many different things, and Elden Ring has so many different variants that the odds are many times whenever you do a dungeon, you will not get a piece of gear or something that is useful to you. I think that is a considerable, I guess you could say, problem, but I don't think it's a big deal. And I also think that I think Elden Ring, for the amount of time, like if I was going to play any game for 150 hours, it would be Elden Ring. Because there are so many different things you can do in the game.
I really like the idea of dungeons, and obviously without them, the world would be much less interesting.
Why is she doing
My
waterfall?
problem is that once you've done a dungeon or two, you've pretty much done all of them. You go inside, kill some smaller enemies, find a lever, and then you fight a mini-boss that might just be a gank fight of another mini-boss that you've already fought.
Yeah.
For example, here's a picture of a dungeon in Limgrave.
That's very fair. That a lot of the mini-bosses are reused. Absolutely. And it would be nice if they had like maybe 3 other variants.
And here's a picture of a dungeon in Caelid. There is nothing notable about these. I don't think I have a single memory of any dungeons that I've done. They are all just kind of meh. The dungeon.
I think I don't agree with that. I think, for example, the dungeons that had the chariot and you had the drop down on the chariot and you destroyed it and you got the tree sentinel armor, that was Liddy on a stack. I think the dungeon at the beginning of Limgrave where you're able to use the stone sword key and you come down at the bottom and it's actually 2 of the grafted scions that ambush you while you get the +1 Erd tree talisman. I think that was also Liddy on a stack. That was crazy. Also, the dungeon where it was like 3 of the same invisible rooms stacked on top of each other. I would argue could even be considered lit. I think so. I think it was interesting. Overall, though, I'm considering, like, what is this? This is like maybe 5 dungeons out of maybe like 30 or 50. So yeah, I think overall this is true. Many of the dungeons are forgettable, but I don't think that necessarily makes them like really bad, because there's many of the areas in Dark Souls 3 and Dark Souls 1 that are kind of forgettable too.
Dungeons and their bosses kind of remind me of both Dark Souls 2 bosses and also Dark Souls 1 demon ruins, where they just started copy and pasting Capra demons and Taurus demons for content. It just felt...
I don't think that was just for content. I think it was designed that way on purpose, because From Software has done this multiple times. Like, for example, the Dragon Rider boss in Dark Souls 2 is also guarding the room to King Vendrick later on in the dungeon as not being a boss. And then you also fight him later on with the 2 of them inside of Drangleic Castle. So I think that From Software definitely has a very big habit of using a boss and then using something as a boss and then making it a normal NPC later on in the game. And I actually, to be fair, I think I kind of like that, because it makes me feel like that's how much I've grown and advanced as a player, that now these previous bosses are just like normal NPCs that I can just kill regularly. So I don't think that was a problem, but I do think that he's totally right fundamentally that Lost Izalith was the weakest point of Dark Souls 1. I think almost everybody agrees with that. And even I think that it's just like well established that like Bed of Chaos, Lost Izalith is bad. However, I think that with Dark Souls 2, the comparisons with like the different bosses is probably also fair. Like, you have a lot of times like you know, the let me think of a good example of this, like reused bosses in Dark Souls 2. I mean, like Smelter Demon. I think Smelter Demon's a great example. You fight Smelter Demon 2 different times. Why do you fight him 2 different times? There's no real reason for it. The Giants. Well, the Giants. I don't know about the Giants either. He's cool though. Yeah, Dragon Rider, Sentinels. Yeah, well, Sentinels, you fight them later on as normal mobs inside of Drangleic Castle as well. You know, like in that room where like everything's a statue, for example. The Pursuer. Yeah. So I think it really depends on like what else the game has to offer, but also Dark Souls 2 probably takes the longest to beat all of the content because there's so much in the game. So I think that like in a way, the problem that like Elden Ring has is similar to the problem that Dark Souls 2 has. It's just that because Elden Ring is a good game, people are okay with it, and because Dark Souls 2 is a bad game, people aren't okay with it.
Very soulless, which is the exact opposite of what the majority of these games are known for. Going back to the network test video, I mentioned that out of the network test, roughly 12 bosses, about a third of those felt like true From Software bosses. Personally,
what?
About a test video, I mentioned that out of the network test, roughly 12 bosses, about a third of those felt like true From Software bosses. Personally, I just don't find these dungeon type bosses to be very interesting at all. And if you were to ask me to list 5 of the dungeon bosses throughout the game, I probably couldn't tell you even 3. They just aren't very memorable, and they just feel like filler content. And that's what...
Well, oftentimes the dungeon bosses are just... like, they're basically a boss that you already are fighting, or an NPC that you're already fighting, but it's like a higher health version of it. So, like, for example, like, the Stone Cats... I would say that the Stone Cats, the Leonine Misbegotten, the Crucible Knights, a lot of them, you fight them in multiple places. I'm trying to think, is there a dungeon boss that I thought was really, really good? I think this is an interesting question. Is there a really, really good dungeon boss? I don't know. I'd have to really think about it. Estelle? Yeah, but like I wouldn't even consider that. The Magma Dragon? The Snail? Yeah, the Snail was memorable in its own way. The one in the mountaintops. Elmer of the Briar? Elmer is not in a... well, he's in a... we're talking about caves. Sorry, I guess like caves and like crypts. Like, Elmer was in the top of, like, that open area. I don't know. I think that he's kind of right about this. that many of those caves are kind of like throwaway content.
They are
Yeah,
filler
catacombs.
content. My other problem is that only a very, very select few are actually worth doing. I honestly find that due to the lack of meaningful loot and runes, I am better off just running past everything and either going straight for the boss or whatever item I may be after. Loot felt mostly meaningless to some degree. The amount of world to explore is amazing, but eventually you realize that you can open a chest that should contain valuables, but instead it contains 5 mushrooms. This creates another problem in itself, which is that some caves and dungeons contain things like the smithing bell bearing, which are pretty much required to do in every playthrough, which makes...
So basically it makes you feel like you have to do every single dungeon because you don't remember or know which dungeons have things that are extremely rewarding. Yeah, I think that's fair.
Makes it feel more like a chore than a meaningful experience. My point is, some pieces of content have absolutely nothing of significance, regardless of your character build, while others have so much significance that you are almost forced to do it or else you are shooting yourself in the foot. My overall point of this video is I would have liked to see how different Elden Ring would have been if instead of going for quantity, we went for quality. I am by no means saying that the main content is bad. Some of the content is the best From Software has ever created, in my opinion.
I think Stormveil Castle is better than anything they've ever made. Or it is at least on par. It is so incredible. It's just so perfect.
Such as Malekith and Melania, I just feel there is a huge quality gap between pieces of content. It makes the experience a lot bigger, but it also makes the experience suffer as a result. That's really about it. My next video is going to be about a mod that fixes some of the issues that are listed in this video. So if that interests you, make sure to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching.
Yeah, I think obviously having an opinion that's critical of Elden Ring always gets met with a lot of resistance. I do think that his criticism is pretty much fair, though. I think that overall this is a valid video. Yeah, there'll never be another Sin's Fortress. Yeah, Sin's Fortress was amazing, but I think Stormveil Castle was amazing in its own way, too. Absolutely. This is some first world problems. Would rather 60 bosses all unique or 165 bosses. They will always complain about something. I think that it's totally fair for people to say that, well, because some of the caves have things that are super important and vital, and other caves have things that are completely useless, I feel like I have to do every cave, even though a lot of them are monotonous and boring, and it creates a repetitive experience. I think saying that is totally fucking fair. Yeah, this is totally fucking fair, man. And I do think that also why I quit Elden Ring a year later, bro, if you play the game for a whole fucking year, it's a single player game, that's pretty fucking good, man. Like, let's be honest, that is pretty fucking good. I'm happy about that. And I still played the game. I think also, it's not like I went back and I played Dark Souls 3 a million times after I beat it. I played it once, and then that was it. And then I came back and I played it multiple times with mods. That's really what happens, is that modding kept Dark Souls alive more than I think even the game itself. So whenever more mods for Elden Ring come out, and I think that the mods can abbreviate the game in certain ways, I think that could happen. I think that you'll see a lot more people playing it. Demonstrated they can create some amazing creatures out in the wild. The idea that didn't follow through until the end game zones was just a letdown. I think that it would have been nice if we had like 3 extra like cave bosses that were like unique to that area.